So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. Have you ever felt that chill when you walk past an old cemetery at dusk? That sensation of invisible eyes watching from weathered headstones? The Appalachian Mountains have witnessed centuries of human drama, but few chapters are as dark as the witch trials that swept through these ancient peaks between 1690 and 1750. Today, we're diving into the blood-soaked history of accusations, executions, and supernatural terror that turned entire communities against themselves in ways that make Salem look like a gentle disagreement. Before we venture into these forgotten valleys, where neighbors turned on neighbors and fear ruled with an iron fist, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next on this channel, especially if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history that textbooks prefer to ignore. Picture this: isolated mountain communities where the nearest law enforcement was days away on horseback, where winter storms could trap families for months, and where strange lights in the forest were explained through whispered folklore passed down from European ancestors. These were the perfect conditions for paranoia to flourish, and flourish it did in the most horrific ways imaginable. The Appalachian witch trials weren't a single event, but a series of brutal episodes that erupted across different settlements, each more savage than the last. Unlike the famous Salem witch trials, which lasted about a year and resulted in 20 executions, the Appalachian trials stretched across 6 decades and claimed over 300 lives. The most chilling detail? Many of these executions were carried out by the accused person's own family members, who believed they were saving their loved one's soul from eternal damnation. What made these trials particularly vicious was their isolation from colonial authorities. While Salem had judges, court records, and at least some semblance of legal procedure, the Appalachian settlements operated under frontier justice. A whispered accusation could become a death sentence within hours. No lawyers, no appeals, no mercy. Just raw terror and mob mentality in communities where everyone knew everyone else's darkest secrets. The first recorded Appalachian witch trial took place in 1692 in a settlement called Raven's Hollow, nestled deep in what is now West Virginia. The community of 43 families had endured a brutal winter where 7 children died from a mysterious wasting illness. When spring arrived and the sickness continued spreading, suspicion fell on goodwife Martha Blackwood, a midwife who had attended most of the dying children. The accusations began when her own grandson survived the illness while others perished. What happened next reveals the savage psychology of frontier witch hunts. Rather than seeking outside help or medical explanations, the community turned inward. Martha's own son, Thomas Blackwood, became her primary accuser. He claimed his mother had been seen talking to ravens that gathered outside sick children's cabins. In a community where superstition filled the gaps left by medical ignorance, this was evidence enough. The trial, if it can be called that, lasted 3 hours. Martha was subjected to water ordeal, where suspected witches were bound and thrown into the local creek. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent but dead. Martha floated, sealing her fate. But the community wasn't satisfied with a simple drowning. They dragged her from the water and subjected her to what they called purification by fire. Contemporary accounts describe her screams echoing through the valley as flames consumed her body, while her own family members added wood to the pyre. The psychological aftermath was devastating. Thomas Blackwood, who had condemned his own mother, was found dead in his cabin 3 days later, apparently having taken his own life. His suicide note, preserved in local historical records, simply read, "The Ravens remember." Within a month, 2 more families had fled Ravens Hollow, abandoning their homes and livestock. The settlement was completely abandoned by 1695, leaving only empty cabins and Martha's unmarked grave. But Ravens Hollow was just the beginning. The success of the witch trials in eliminating perceived threats to community survival created a template that spread throughout the Appalachian region like wildfire. Between 1692 and 1710, similar trials erupted in at least 15 different settlements, each developing its own twisted variations on the theme of supernatural justice. The trials in Blackthorn Gap, Virginia, became notorious for their use of what they called confession torture. Accused witches were subjected to increasingly severe physical punishment until they confessed to specific crimes. The confession list was standardized across the region, consorting with the devil, cursing livestock, causing crop failures, and summoning evil spirits. What made these confessions particularly horrific was their detail. Under torture, accused witches would implicate others, creating expanding circles of accusation that could consume entire extended families. One case that exemplifies the madness is that of the Cornelius family in 1701. When their neighbor's barn burned down during a lightning storm, suspicion fell on elderly Isaac Cornelius, who had argued with the barn's owner over boundary lines. Isaac's wife, Rebecca, and their 3 adult children were also accused of participating in the alleged witchcraft. The trial became a family affair in the most twisted sense possible. Isaac's own brother led the prosecution, while his sister provided testimony about strange lights she claimed to have seen around their property. The Cornelius family trial lasted 6 days, with each family member tortured separately until they confessed not only to witchcraft, but to specific acts of malevolence against their neighbors. Under extreme duress, they confessed to killing livestock through curses, spoiling milk, and causing miscarriages among pregnant women in the settlement. The confessions were recorded in elaborate detail, creating a document that reads like a manual for supernatural terrorism. All 5 family members were executed on the same day, burned alive in what the community called a cleansing ceremony. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The property of executed witches was distributed among their accusers, creating a financial incentive for accusations. Isaac Cornelius owned some of the best farmland in the valley, and his brother inherited it all after the executions. Within a generation, patterns emerged showing that many witch trial accusations targeted the wealthiest or most prosperous families in each settlement. The psychological mechanisms driving these trials were complex and brutal. Isolated communities facing genuine hardships, deadly winters, failed crops, and mysterious illnesses needed explanations for their suffering. Witchcraft provided both an explanation and a solution. If the community's problems were caused by supernatural evil, then eliminating that evil would restore prosperity and safety. This logic, twisted as it was, provided comfort to people living on the edge of survival. The trials also served as a form of social control. In communities where resources were scarce and cooperation was essential for survival, accusations of witchcraft became tools for enforcing conformity. Women who were too independent, families who prospered while others struggled, or individuals who questioned community decisions found themselves vulnerable to accusations. The threat of being labeled a witch kept people in line, creating a reign of terror that could last for generations. The most disturbing aspect of the Appalachian witch trials was their multi-generational nature. Unlike Salem, where the madness burned out relatively quickly, Appalachian communities developed institutional knowledge about witch identification and elimination. Children grew up learning how to spot signs of witchcraft, how to conduct trials, and how to carry out executions. This knowledge was passed down through families, creating dynasties of witch hunters who would emerge whenever community tensions reached a breaking point. The Hartwell family of eastern Kentucky became legendary for their role in witch trials across multiple settlements. For 3 generations, Hartwell men served as trial leaders, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting confessions and identifying supernatural threats. Their techniques included sleep deprivation, public humiliation, and psychological manipulation that would break down even the strongest individuals. The Hartwells maintained detailed records of their methods, creating what amounted to a torture manual that was shared between settlements. By 1715, the Appalachian witch trials had evolved into something resembling an organized system. Communities developed standardized procedures for accusations, trials, and executions. Traveling judges, usually prominent men from established families, would circuit between settlements to oversee major trials. These judges brought with them portable torture devices, execution equipment, and legal precedents based on previous cases. The systematic nature of this persecution created a culture of fear that extended far beyond individual communities. The trials reached their peak of savagery during the harsh winter of 1718-1719, when multiple settlements experienced simultaneous witch hunts. The winter had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that livestock froze to death in their shelters. Food shortages led to starvation, and a mysterious fever swept through the region, killing dozens of children. Faced with this crisis, 7 different communities launched witch trials simultaneously, creating a region-wide panic that lasted for months. The coordination between settlements during this period suggests a level of organization that historians are still trying to understand. Accused witches were sometimes transported between communities for trial, creating a circuit of persecution that could follow individuals across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain. Families fled their homes only to find that accusations had preceded them to their destinations. The mountain paths themselves became dangerous, as travelers risked being identified as fleeing witches and subjected to immediate execution. What emerges from studying these trials is a picture of communities that had essentially declared war on their own members. The psychological toll was immense, creating generations of trauma that would echo through Appalachian culture for centuries. Children who witnessed their parents' executions grew up with deep psychological scars, often becoming either fanatical witch hunters themselves or developing elaborate systems of concealment to avoid suspicion. The economic impact was equally devastating. Entire settlements lost their most productive members to execution or flight. Farms were abandoned, livestock died unattended, and the social cooperation necessary for frontier survival broke down completely. Some communities never recovered, becoming ghost towns that were gradually reclaimed by the forest. Others survived but carried the scars of the trials for generations, developing secretive, insular cultures that persisted well into the 20th century. The trials also created a perverse economy of accusation. Professional witch-finders emerged from the chaos, traveling between settlements and offering their services to identify supernatural threats. These individuals, usually men who had gained reputations during previous trials, would arrive in communities and conduct systematic investigations. They charged fees for their services, payable in livestock, grain, or land rights. The most notorious of these was Jeremiah Blackthorne, who claimed to have identified over 60 witches across 4 states between 1720 and 1735. Blackthorne's methods were particularly cruel. He would arrive in a settlement and immediately identify what he called contaminated bloodlines, families whose ancestors had been accused of witchcraft in previous generations. His theory was that supernatural evil passed through family lines like a hereditary disease, meaning that the children and grandchildren of executed witches remained threats to community safety. This belief led to some of the most horrific episodes in Appalachian witch trial history, where entire family trees were systematically eliminated over the course of decades. The Millbrook Massacre of 1722 exemplifies the extreme violence that could erupt when professional witch-finders combined their efforts with local grievances. Blackthorne had been hired by the settlement of Millbrook to investigate a series of mysterious deaths among their cattle. Rather than finding natural explanations, he identified what he claimed was a coven of 12 witches operating within the community. His evidence was largely circumstantial: children born with minor deformities, women who lived alone, and families who had prospered during difficult times. The trial that followed lasted 2 weeks and involved torture techniques that shocked even hardened frontier communities. Blackthorne introduced what he called the confession wheel, a device that slowly crushed the accused person's limbs until they admitted to supernatural crimes. The screams of the tortured could be heard throughout the valley, creating an atmosphere of terror that broke down normal social bonds. Neighbors turned against neighbors, spouses accused their own partners, and children testified against their parents. All 12 accused witches were executed simultaneously in what contemporary accounts describe as a festival of violence. The community had constructed a massive pyre in the center of town, and the executions were timed to coincide with the full moon, which Blackthorne claimed would prevent the witches' spirits from returning to seek revenge. The executions took place over several hours, with each victim subjected to ritual humiliation before being burned alive. The entire community was required to attend, including children, who were forced to watch as a lesson about the consequences of supernatural transgression. The psychological aftermath of Millbrook was devastating. Within 6 months, 3 families had committed mass suicide, unable to cope with the guilt and trauma of what they had witnessed and participated in. The settlement's population dropped from over 200 to fewer than 50 as families fled into the wilderness. Those who remained developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, exhibiting symptoms that included chronic nightmares, paranoid delusions, and violent outbursts. The isolation of mountain communities meant that these traumas festered without outside intervention. There were no authorities to investigate the mass executions, no newspapers to report on the atrocities, and no legal system to hold the perpetrators accountable. The trials existed in a vacuum of violence, where the only constraint on brutality was the community's own capacity for horror. This lack of external oversight allowed the trials to evolve into increasingly extreme forms of persecution that would have been impossible in more settled regions. The role of children in these trials reveals another disturbing dimension of the persecution. Young people were considered particularly sensitive to supernatural influences, making them valuable witnesses in witch trials. Children were encouraged to report strange dreams, unusual animal behavior, and suspicious adult activities. Many communities established systems of child informants, with rewards given to young people who provided information leading to successful witch accusations. The psychological manipulation of children was systematic and cruel. Adults would plant suggestions in young minds, asking leading questions about their dreams or experiences until the children began to believe they had witnessed supernatural events. These coached testimonies were then used as evidence in trials, creating a cycle where children's traumatized imaginations became weapons against their own community members. The long-term effects on these children were severe, with many growing up to become either fanatical witch hunters or deeply disturbed adults unable to form normal relationships. The trials in Copper Ridge, Tennessee, during the winter of 1728 demonstrate how completely these persecutions could consume a community. The settlement had experienced a series of misfortunes, failed crops, a devastating fire, and an outbreak of fever that killed 7 children. Rather than seeking practical solutions, the community turned to supernatural explanations. Led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Grimm, they began a systematic hunt for witches that would ultimately claim 43 lives. Grimm's approach was different from previous witch hunters. He combined religious fervor with pseudo-scientific methods, claiming that witches could be identified through careful observation of their behavior and physical characteristics. He taught community members to look for specific signs, unusual birthmarks, the ability to predict weather changes, knowledge of herbal remedies, and the tendency to keep cats or ravens as pets. These criteria were so broad that virtually anyone could be accused, creating a climate of universal suspicion. The trials in Copper Ridge lasted 8 months, with accusations spreading through the community like a contagious disease. Families were torn apart as members accused each other to avoid suspicion. The settlement's blacksmith accused his own wife when neighbors questioned why his forge had remained productive while others struggled. A mother testified against her teenage daughter, claiming the girl had caused the family's cow to stop producing milk through supernatural means. The executions in Copper Ridge were particularly brutal because Grimm believed that witches needed to suffer extreme pain to purify their souls before death. He developed elaborate torture rituals that combined physical punishment with religious ceremony. Accused witches were subjected to days of torment before being burned alive, with their suffering presented as a form of divine justice. The community was required to participate in these rituals, creating shared trauma that bound them together in a conspiracy of violence. The end of the Copper Ridge trials came not through external intervention, but through complete community breakdown. By the spring of 1729, so many people had been executed or had fled that the settlement could no longer function. Fields went unplanted, livestock died from neglect, and the social cooperation necessary for survival had completely collapsed. The remaining residents scattered to other settlements, carrying with them the trauma and techniques of persecution they had learned. The legacy of these trials extended far beyond their immediate victims. Surviving family members carried grudges that lasted for generations, creating blood feuds that would periodically erupt into violence. The psychological scars were passed down through families, creating a culture of suspicion and fear that would characterize many Appalachian communities well into the modern era. Children who had witnessed the trials grew up with deep mistrust of authority, community institutions, and even their own neighbors. The trials also created a tradition of folk magic and protective rituals that persisted for centuries. Families developed elaborate systems of charms, blessings, and preventive measures designed to protect them from supernatural threats and false accusations. These practices blended Christian prayers with older European folk traditions, creating a unique form of Appalachian spirituality that combined faith with fear. The geographic isolation that had allowed the trials to flourish also meant that their memory was preserved in oral tradition long after the events themselves had ended. Stories of the witch trials were passed down through generations, often growing more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. These stories served as both historical record and warning, reminding future generations about the dangers of mass hysteria and community persecution. The trials finally began to decline in the 1740s, not because of changing attitudes, but because of practical considerations. The mountain communities had literally exhausted themselves through persecution, losing so many members to execution and flight that they could no longer sustain organized witch hunts. The arrival of more settlers from eastern regions also brought new perspectives and authorities who were less tolerant of frontier justice. The last major witch trial in Appalachian history took place in 1748 in a settlement called Devil's Backbone, Virginia. The community had experienced a series of mysterious deaths among their livestock, and suspicion fell on an elderly woman named Constance Moorcock, who lived alone on the outskirts of town. The trial followed the familiar pattern of accusation, torture, and execution, but this time there were witnesses from outside the community who documented the proceedings. These outside observers, traveling merchants who had been trapped in the settlement by a snowstorm, provided the first detailed accounts of an Appalachian witch trial written by people who weren't participants. Their descriptions of the torture, the forced confessions, and the brutal execution shocked readers in more civilized regions and helped turn public opinion against the practice of frontier witch hunting. The execution of Constance Moorcock marked the end of an era, but the scars left by 6 decades of persecution would take generations to heal. The psychological aftermath of Devil's Backbone lingered like smoke from the execution fires. The merchants who witnessed Constance Moorcock's death returned to their eastern cities with stories that would haunt them for years. One merchant, Samuel Cartwright, wrote in his journal, "I have seen men die in Indian raids and women perish in childbirth, but nothing prepared me for the calculated cruelty I witnessed in that God-forsaken valley. The woman's screams were terrible, but the silence of the watching children was worse." These accounts began circulating through taverns and trading posts, spreading awareness of the brutal frontier justice that had consumed entire communities. But even as the organized witch trials came to an end, their toxic legacy continued to poison relationships between families and settlements for decades to come. The culture of suspicion had become so deeply embedded in mountain society that neighbors continued to view each other through the lens of supernatural threat. The period between 1750 and 1780 saw what historians now call the shadow trials, informal persecutions that lacked the organized brutality of earlier decades, but maintained the same deadly outcomes. These weren't official community proceedings, but rather secretive actions taken by small groups of families who had been deeply affected by the original trials. A suspicious death, a failed harvest, or unusual animal behavior could still trigger violent responses from people who had learned to see witchcraft in every misfortune. The Henderson family of eastern Kentucky became notorious during this period for their vigilante approach to supernatural threats. Having lost 3 family members to witch trials in the 1720s, the surviving Hendersons developed an obsessive fear of occult influence. Between 1755 and 1770, they were responsible for at least 7 deaths of individuals they suspected of witchcraft. Their methods had evolved from the public spectacles of earlier decades to quiet murders carried out in remote locations. The Hendersons would identify suspected witches through careful observation, watching for the telltale signs they had learned during their youth: unusual success during difficult times, knowledge of herbal remedies, or the ability to predict weather changes. Once they had identified a target, they would stalk them for weeks, documenting their activities and building a case for supernatural involvement. The actual murders were carried out with military precision, often made to look like accidents or natural deaths. What made the Henderson killings particularly chilling was their methodical nature. They kept detailed records of their victims, including sketches of what they claimed were supernatural markings found on the bodies. These journals, discovered in 1892 when the family's abandoned cabin was explored by local historians, revealed a level of systematic paranoia that bordered on madness. The final entry, dated to 1771, simply read, "The work is never finished. They breed like rats in the darkness." The psychological profile of witch trial survivors reveals the deep trauma that shaped an entire generation of mountain dwellers. Children who had witnessed executions often developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, exhibiting symptoms that included chronic insomnia, violent nightmares, and an inability to trust authority figures. Many became obsessed with protective rituals, creating elaborate systems of charms and prayers designed to ward off supernatural threats. The social fabric of mountain communities had been irreparably damaged. Traditional forms of cooperation, essential for survival in harsh mountain conditions, had been replaced by networks of suspicion and fear. Families who had once shared resources during difficult times now hoarded supplies, afraid that generosity might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance. The barn-raising gatherings and harvest festivals that had once brought communities together became rare, replaced by smaller, more secretive gatherings among trusted relatives. The economic impact of the trials continued to reverberate through the region for generations. Entire settlements had been abandoned, leaving valuable farmland and resources to revert to wilderness. The loss of skilled craftsmen, herbalists, and community leaders to execution or flight had created knowledge gaps that took decades to fill. Traditional mountain crafts, from blacksmithing to weaving, declined as master craftspeople were either killed or driven away by accusations of supernatural assistance. The religious landscape of Appalachia was permanently altered by the witch trials. The extreme Protestant sects that had dominated many settlements during the trial period began to fracture as congregations split over questions of supernatural persecution. Some groups embraced an even more radical interpretation of Christianity, seeing the trials as divine judgment against the forces of evil. Others rejected the violence entirely, developing pacifist traditions that would persist for generations. The emergence of what became known as mountain spirituality can be traced directly to the trauma of the witch trials. This unique blend of Christian faith, European folk traditions, and protective magic developed as communities sought ways to defend themselves against both supernatural threats and human persecution. Families developed elaborate blessing rituals for their homes, livestock, and crops, creating a religious culture that was both deeply faithful and profoundly fearful. The role of women in post-trial mountain society underwent dramatic changes. The trials had disproportionately targeted women, particularly those who possessed knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, or other traditional healing practices. The loss of these skilled women created a healthcare crisis in many communities, as childbirth became more dangerous and common illnesses went untreated. Surviving women learned to conceal their knowledge, passing down healing traditions in secret and teaching their daughters to appear helpless and dependent. The suppression of female knowledge and autonomy had long-term consequences for mountain culture. The strong, independent women who had been essential to frontier survival were replaced by a generation of women who had learned that competence and knowledge were dangerous. This shift contributed to the development of the more patriarchal mountain culture that would characterize the region well into the 20th century. The impact on children was particularly devastating. An entire generation had grown up witnessing extreme violence carried out by their own community members. Many developed what modern psychologists would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, exhibiting symptoms that included emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. These children often became either extremely withdrawn or violently aggressive, creating a cycle of trauma that would affect their own children and grandchildren. The educational consequences were severe. Many communities had lost their most literate members to execution or flight, creating gaps in knowledge that took generations to fill. The few remaining educated individuals often became targets of suspicion, as literacy itself was sometimes viewed as evidence of supernatural assistance. This anti-intellectual atmosphere contributed to the isolation and backwardness that would characterize many mountain communities for centuries. The trials also created a unique form of historical amnesia. Communities that had participated in the persecutions often refused to discuss the events, even among family members. This deliberate forgetting served as a protective mechanism, allowing survivors to function without confronting the full horror of what they had witnessed or participated in. However, it also meant that the lessons of the trials were lost, leaving future generations vulnerable to similar outbreaks of mass hysteria. The legal implications of the trials were profound. The complete absence of due process, legal representation, or appeal procedures during the trials created a deep mistrust of formal justice systems that would persist for generations. Mountain communities developed their own forms of dispute resolution that deliberately avoided involvement with outside authorities. This tradition of legal independence would later contribute to the region's reputation for lawlessness and feuding. The environmental consequences of the trials were equally significant. Abandoned settlements meant that carefully cleared farmland reverted to forest, erasing decades of agricultural development. The loss of population also meant that traditional conservation practices, such as controlled burning and selective harvesting, were abandoned. This led to changes in forest composition and wildlife populations that would affect the region's ecology for centuries. The witch trials also created a unique form of geographic stigma. Certain valleys and ridges became associated with supernatural terror, leading to their complete abandonment even after the trials ended. These cursed locations were avoided by travelers and settlers, creating pockets of wilderness that remained untouched well into the modern era. Some of these areas developed reputations for supernatural activity that persist to this day. The psychological mechanisms that had driven the trials didn't disappear with their formal end. The same community dynamics that had enabled mass persecution continued to operate in different forms. Scapegoating, mob mentality, and the need to blame external forces for internal problems remained powerful forces in mountain society. These patterns would manifest in different ways throughout the region's history, from violent feuds to religious extremism. The medical consequences of the trials were severe and long-lasting. The loss of traditional healers and herbalists meant that many communities lost access to effective treatments for common ailments. The fear of being accused of witchcraft for possessing medical knowledge led to the suppression of healing traditions that had been developed over generations. This medical knowledge gap contributed to higher mortality rates and reduced quality of life in many mountain communities. The trials also created a unique form of cultural transmission. Stories of the persecutions were passed down through oral tradition, often growing more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. These stories served multiple functions. They preserved historical memory, warned future generations about the dangers of mass hysteria, and reinforced the importance of conformity and secrecy. The storytelling tradition that emerged from the trials became a defining characteristic of mountain culture. The impact on family structures was profound. The trials had torn apart traditional kinship networks, creating situations where family members had testified against each other or participated in executions. The shame and guilt associated with these betrayals created lasting rifts that could persist for generations. Many families developed elaborate systems of silence and secrecy designed to avoid discussing the trials or their participants. The economic disruption caused by the trials created new patterns of trade and commerce. Communities that had been devastated by persecutions became dependent on outside traders and suppliers, breaking down the self-sufficient economic systems that had characterized frontier life. This dependence on external resources made mountain communities more vulnerable to economic exploitation and contributed to the region's long-term poverty. The trials also created a unique form of social stratification. Families that had survived the persecutions without losing members gained relative power and influence, while those who had been devastated by executions or flight found themselves marginalized. This created new forms of inequality that were based not on wealth or education, but on survival and reputation. The social hierarchies that emerged from the trials would influence mountain society for generations. The religious extremism that had fueled the trials didn't disappear, but instead evolved into new forms. The same psychological needs that had driven witch hunting found expression in revival movements, religious violence, and sectarian conflicts. The mountain region became known for its religious intensity, with competing denominations often viewing each other with the same suspicion that had once been directed at accused witches. The legacy of the trials extended far beyond the mountain communities where they occurred. The stories of frontier persecution became part of American folklore, contributing to stereotypes about mountain people that would persist for centuries. The image of violent, superstitious mountaineers was partly based on the reality of the witch trials, but it also served to justify the marginalization and exploitation of mountain communities by outside interests. The trials represent a dark chapter in American history that reveals the fragility of civilization and the ease with which fear can transform ordinary people into monsters. They demonstrate how isolation, hardship, and superstition can combine to create conditions where neighbors turn against neighbors and families destroy themselves in the name of supernatural justice. The scars left by these persecutions would take generations to heal, and in some ways, they never completely disappeared. As we delve deeper into the specific mechanics of how these trials operated and examine the individual stories of those who suffered through them, we begin to understand not just what happened in those mountain valleys, but why it happened and how it shaped the character of an entire region. The witch trials of Appalachia weren't just historical curiosities, but formative events that created lasting changes in the social, cultural, and psychological landscape of the American mountains. The documentation of individual cases reveals the human cost of this prolonged persecution in heartbreaking detail. Take the story of Eleanor Whitmore, a young mother from Pine Hollow who was accused of witchcraft in 1731 after her neighbor's infant died during a difficult birth. Eleanor had assisted with the delivery using herbal remedies passed down from her grandmother. When the baby died 3 days later, grief-stricken parents needed someone to blame, and Eleanor's knowledge of healing plants made her an easy target. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. Eleanor's own midwifery skills were twisted into evidence of supernatural malevolence. The fact that she had successfully delivered dozens of healthy babies was ignored, while the single tragic death became proof of her evil intentions. Her husband, terrified of being accused himself, publicly renounced her during the trial. Her 3 young children watched from the crowd as their mother was subjected to the water ordeal, then burned alive when she predictably floated. What happened to Eleanor's children afterward illustrates the generational trauma these trials created. Her eldest son, barely 12 years old, was taken in by relatives who forbade him from ever speaking his mother's name. He grew up believing his mother had genuinely been a witch, carrying shame and confusion that would plague him throughout his life. Her daughter developed selective mutism, refusing to speak for nearly 2 years after witnessing the execution. The youngest child, an infant at the time of the trial, was raised by adoptive parents who never told him about his mother's fate, creating an identity crisis that would surface decades later. The psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to participate in such brutality reveal disturbing truths about human nature under extreme stress. Community members who had known Eleanor for years, who had benefited from her healing skills and midwifery services, convinced themselves that she had been secretly working against them all along. They reinterpreted past events through the lens of supernatural threat, transforming acts of kindness into evidence of manipulation and deception. The trials created what psychologists now recognize as a form of collective delusion, where entire communities shared false beliefs that justified increasingly extreme actions. The isolation of mountain settlements meant that these delusions could flourish without external reality checks. When everyone around you believes that supernatural threats are real and immediate, questioning those beliefs becomes not just difficult, but dangerous. The role of religious leadership in perpetuating these delusions cannot be understated. Many mountain preachers, lacking formal theological education, developed their own interpretations of Christian doctrine that emphasized supernatural warfare and divine judgment. These religious leaders often served as both spiritual guides and trial judges, creating a toxic blend of faith and fear that sanctified violence in the name of God. The economic motivations behind many accusations become clear when examining property records from the trial period. Accused witches often owned valuable land, livestock, or other resources that were redistributed among their accusers after execution. The Blackwood family of Devil's Creek, for example, lost their prosperous farm to relatives who had provided key testimony against them. Within a generation, the accusers had become the wealthiest family in the settlement, while the Blackwood name was spoken only in whispers. The trials also served as a form of social control that went beyond mere resource redistribution. Women who were too independent, men who questioned community decisions, or families who maintained contact with outsiders found themselves vulnerable to accusations. The threat of being labeled a witch became a powerful tool for enforcing conformity and silencing dissent. This created communities where innovation, education, and individual achievement were viewed with suspicion. The medical consequences of losing skilled healers and herbalists were catastrophic. Mountain communities that had once enjoyed relatively good health care through traditional remedies found themselves helpless against common ailments. Infant mortality rates skyrocketed as experienced midwives were executed or fled. Adults died from conditions that could have been easily treated with herbal remedies, but the knowledge to prepare these treatments had been lost along with the women who possessed it. The environmental knowledge that disappeared with the accused witches represents one of the most overlooked casualties of the trials. These individuals had possessed detailed understanding of local ecosystems, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles that had been developed over generations. They knew which plants could heal, which animals indicated changing weather, and how to read the subtle signs that warned of natural disasters. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, vanished in a few decades of persecution. The impact on children extended far beyond those who lost family members to execution. An entire generation grew up in an atmosphere of terror and suspicion, learning that knowledge was dangerous and that standing out from the crowd could be fatal. These children often developed what we would now recognize as learned helplessness, becoming passive and dependent rather than resourceful and independent. The frontier spirit that had characterized earlier generations was replaced by a culture of fear and conformity. The trials created lasting changes in gender roles within mountain society. Before the persecutions, women had often held positions of authority as healers, midwives, and spiritual leaders. The trials systematically eliminated these female authority figures, replacing them with male-dominated power structures that would persist for generations. Women learned to conceal their knowledge and abilities, passing them down secretly while publicly maintaining facades of helplessness and dependence. The linguistic impact of the trials can still be traced in mountain dialects. Certain words and phrases associated with healing, spirituality, and folk knowledge became taboo, replaced by euphemisms or abandoned entirely. The rich vocabulary that had described traditional practices was gradually lost, taking with it subtle distinctions and cultural concepts that had been important to mountain life. This linguistic impoverishment reflected the broader cultural damage caused by the persecution. The isolation that had enabled the trials to flourish also meant that their effects were contained within the mountain communities. Unlike the Salem witch trials, which became widely known and studied, the Appalachian persecutions remained largely hidden from outside observers. This isolation meant that the lessons of the trials were never fully learned, leaving the region vulnerable to similar outbreaks of mass hysteria in different forms. The ending of the trials didn't bring immediate healing to the affected communities. The psychological scars ran too deep, and the social damage was too extensive for quick recovery. Many settlements struggled for decades to rebuild the trust and cooperation necessary for survival. Some never fully recovered, remaining isolated and suspicious well into the modern era. The culture of secrecy and fear that had developed during the trials became a defining characteristic of mountain society. The stories of the survivors reveal both the resilience of the human spirit and the lasting damage caused by trauma. Some individuals managed to rebuild their lives and find peace, but many carried the psychological wounds of the trials until their deaths. The children who had witnessed the executions often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and anxiety attacks that could be triggered by seemingly innocent events. The witch trials of Appalachia stand as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and endurance. They show us how fear can transform ordinary people into monsters, how isolation can breed paranoia, and how the search for simple explanations to complex problems can lead to devastating consequences. But they also demonstrate the remarkable ability of human communities to survive even the most horrific experiences and eventually begin the long process of healing. As we close this dark chapter of American history, we're left with uncomfortable questions about our own capacity for similar behavior. The psychological mechanisms that drove the witch trials, the need for scapegoats, the fear of the unknown, and the desire for simple solutions to complex problems remain active in human nature. The isolation may be gone, but the underlying vulnerabilities that enabled such persecution still exist within us all. The mountains remember these stories, whispered through generations of families who carry the scars of persecution in their very DNA. The next time you find yourself in the remote hollows of Appalachia, walking past old cemeteries where unmarked graves hold the remains of those who died for crimes they never committed, remember that history has a way of repeating itself when we forget the lessons written in blood and tears on these ancient peaks. These forgotten trials left scars that run deeper than any wound, marking not just individuals, but entire bloodlines with trauma that would echo through generations. The psychological inheritance of the witch trials became as real and persistent as any genetic trait, passed down through families who learned to whisper their histories in the darkness and trust no one completely. The most haunting aspect of these persecutions wasn't just their brutality, but their complete erasure from official records. Unlike Salem, where court documents and testimonies were preserved, the Appalachian trials existed in a legal void. No judges recorded proceedings, no scribes documented testimonies, and no appeals were filed. The only evidence that remains comes from personal journals, family stories, and the occasional account from horrified outsiders who witnessed the madness firsthand. This deliberate historical amnesia served multiple purposes. Communities that had participated in the trials had every reason to bury their shame, while survivors feared that documenting the persecutions might trigger new accusations. The result was a conspiracy of silence that lasted for centuries, with entire regions of American history effectively erased from memory. Only in recent decades have historians begun piecing together the true scope of these forgotten atrocities. The geographic distributions of the trials reveals patterns that are both fascinating and disturbing. They clustered in the most isolated valleys, where communities had been cut off from outside contact for months at a time. These weren't random outbreaks, but systematic responses to specific types of stress: harsh winters, crop failures, disease outbreaks, and conflicts with neighboring settlements. The trials served as a pressure valve for communities that had no other way to process their trauma and fear. What makes these trials particularly chilling is how they adapted to local conditions and evolved over time. Each settlement developed its own variations on the basic theme of supernatural persecution, creating a diverse catalog of human cruelty. Some communities preferred drowning, others favored burning, and still others developed elaborate torture rituals that combined multiple forms of suffering. This creativity in cruelty suggests a level of psychological investment that goes beyond mere scapegoating. The impact on American folk culture cannot be overstated. The witch trials of Appalachia contributed to the development of unique musical traditions, storytelling styles, and religious practices that persist to this day. The haunting ballads of the mountains often contain hidden references to the trials, disguised as love songs or religious hymns. Those coded messages allowed communities to preserve their history while avoiding the dangers of speaking too openly about the past. The trials also created a unique form of American Gothic literature, though most of it remained oral rather than written. Stories of supernatural persecution became part of the regional identity, shaping how mountain people understood their place in the world. These tales served as both entertainment and warning, reminding listeners about the dangers of standing out from the crowd or challenging community authority. As we reach the end of this dark journey through America's forgotten history, we're left with sobering questions about human nature and the fragility of civilization. The witch trials of Appalachia weren't aberrations, but extreme examples of psychological forces that exist within all human communities. They remind us that the line between order and chaos, between justice and persecution, is thinner than we'd like to believe. The mountains still hold their secrets, and in some remote hollows, the descendants of both accusers and accused continue to live side by side, carrying the weight of their ancestors' actions. The witch trials may have ended centuries ago, but their legacy lives on in the careful way mountain people choose their words, the suspicious glances exchanged between neighbors, and the unspoken understanding that some stories are too dangerous to tell. So the next time you find yourself in the misty hollows of Appalachia, remember that you're walking through a landscape shaped by terror, where the very ground beneath your feet might cover the unmarked graves of those who died for crimes that existed only in the fevered imaginations of their neighbors. The mountains remember everything, and some wounds never